Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Muzamil Liaqat Ali for the second session on body fluid lecture series. Before we move forward, let me ask you something clinically very important or relevant. If a patient loses fluid, where does it go first? Your blood, your cells, or the interstitium? And more importantly, how does this translate into symptoms? And in this session, we are transitioning from basic concept, session 1, into the functional understanding of body fluids, how body fluids are distributed, how they behave biochemically and physically, and how these properties, how these properties influence real clinical outcomes. By the end of this session, we will be able to understand, quantify, and visualize fluid distribution in the body compartments. Second would be differentiate intracellular and extracellular fluid or fluids with composition-based reasoning. Number 3, understand surface tension, viscosity, and osmosis, not as definition, but as functional forces. And the most important thing, the application of all these properties, the surface tension, viscosity, and osmosis. So, the learning resources, you can have the Chatterjee, the Mushtaq Biochemistry, or of course, the lectures are there for the guidance as well, right? Let's start with introduction to body fluids. Body fluids are not just water. They are a dynamic biochemical system. So what about its composition? Water, that accounts 60 to 70%. Electrolytes, mainly included sodium, potassium, chloride, proteins, and metabolites. Each component has a different and unique or important physiological and biochemical role. So what are the major functions of all these components? The very first one is the nutrient transport, right? Glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, the transport of the nutrient content, right? That is the primary function. Waste removal, temperature regulation, and pH maintenance. Think of body fluids as a transport of highways and regulatory system, that is combined in a single, entity in a body. So let's talk about the distribution of body fluids. Total body water is not uniformly distributed. Total body water, if you consider the 60 to 70% of the total body weight, out of that, 50% is your ICF, intracellular fluid, and the 20% is your extracellular fluid, ECF. So let's talk about the clinical angles at this point. Dehydration primarily affects the ECF first. Cellular dehydration happens later. So you guys must realize compartments, not memorizing, the numbers only. Let's talk about the further breakdown of the fluids. Extracellular fluid compartment. ECF is divided into interstitial fluid and the plasma. Interstitial fluid, that is 15%, and the plasma of 5%. Interstitial fluid is the exchange zone of every single content, that is going to exchange between the fluid compartments, right? What about the plasma? The main role is a transport. This compartment act as a transport medium, right? So what about the clinical correlation? Edema, that is the excess of interstitial fluid. And what about the plasma reduction, levels in your body that you ultimately lose the blood, or that now the content of the total plasma is going to reduce in such a case. Same ECF, but different functional roles, right? Let's talk about the types of body fluids, ICF versus ECF. Intracellular fluid, or the ICF, right? That is ultimately, as you know, the location is that is found inside the cell, the cytoplasm, and the composition that is, that contains high levels of potassium and magnesium. And what about the ECF? That is, that surrounds the cell. That is the primary location of ECF. And the composition include interstitial fluid that is found in the spaces between cells, and the plasma that is a liquid component of your blood. So now let's talk about the composition of extracellular fluid. Right? Interstitial fluid that contains electrolytes, nutrients, hormones, and cellular waste products. Whatever its function, facilitates exchange of substances between blood and cells. Right? And the other compartment, that is plasma, right? That, the composition mainly include water, proteins, albumin, globulin, the fibrinogen, electrolytes, hormones, gases, and waste products. What about the function, right? Transport of nutrient, gases, waste products, hormones, and maintenance of osmotic pressure, right? Now, let's discuss the difference between the interstitial fluid compartment and or the interstitial fluid or intracellular fluid versus the extracellular fluid. ICF has more proteins, while ECF has no proteins in interstitial fluid, or protein present in plasma component only. More potassium is there in case of, the inside of cell, and less potassium in case of ECF, right? Extracellular fluid. Less sodium in ICF, as you know, the sodium is higher concentration in ECF. More phosphatines is present, inside the cell, and the more chloride ions, along with, as you know, the sodium is the main content of the ECF. So along with sodium, the chloride is also on a higher side. Let's discuss the important physical properties of the fluids, right? Or the biochemical properties a fluid can have in our body, right? Fluid behavior is governed by physical forces, right? Three pillars are there, right? The very first one is the surface tension, second, the viscosity, and osmosis. Right? These are invisible forces but clinically powerful. So, in this session, we will conclude till the surface tension only. Tendency of liquid surface to minimize area due to cohesive force, right? That is the definition of surface tension. Okay. Then water forms droplets due to the surface tension, right? As you can see, or one can have visualization or given in the illustration, right? And what about the mechanism behind it? Molecules at the surface pulled inwards, and that created or creates a surface film that leads to ultimately the dewdrop formation, right? Now let's discuss the high yield clinical concept, right? What is the clinical implication of the surface tension and lipidization? This is the high yield clinical concept. So when you consume or when there are large fat globules present in your diet, so as you know, the larger the fat globules, low surface area will be having, right? So enzymes cannot act efficiently. So let's talk about the role of bile salts. Reduce the surface tension. That is the primary function of the bile salts, right? That's being produced by your gallbladder, right? Next is the break fat into small droplets. Emulsification is the process, right? So, as if the surface area is increased, the enzymic activity or the efficiency would ultimately increase, right? So, bile deficiency means fat malabsorption. Now, the viscosity, resistance of fluid to flow, that is known as or defined as the viscosity, right? Example, honey that got high viscosity or the water that got, low viscosity. Viscosity is basically equals to internal friction produced by the molecules of any of the content that is present in a solution. The core concept is right on your screens, right? Blood flow is irreversibly related to viscosity, right? So what are its determinants, right? Vessel length, and blood viscosity. These are the main determinants of your blood flow. So let's talk about the clinical things at this very point. Polycythemia is one of the term, right? In that case, there will be high viscosity, and that ultimately leads to low flow, right? And what about the anemias? There will be low viscosity and the flow will be on a higher side, right? So, in a nutshell, too thick, slow circulation; too thin, inefficient transport. Now, let's discuss the osmosis, right? Movement of water across a semipermeable membrane is known as or defined as osmosis. The direction, that is from low solute concentration to higher solute concentration. That is the definition of osmosis, right? So, what about the key role or the key rule that is linked with the osmosis? Water follows solute, especially the sodium. So, clinical correlation at this very point is edema that leads to fluid shift into the interstitial space. And what about the IV fluids that ultimately alters osmotic gradients? Where sodium goes, water ultimately follows it, right? Today, you didn't just study fluids, you understood how the body manages, distributes, and controls them under physiological and pathological conditions. If you remember one thing, remember this: fluid movement is never random, it is governed by forces osmotic, physical, and biochemical. So, thank you. In the next session, we will elevate this understanding into clinical problem solving, especially the fluid imbalance and its disorders, right? That is ultimately, we'll discuss ultimately the final thing that is very important, the last physical chemical property of fluids, the osmosis, right? Thank you very much. If you like that content, or that help you in understanding the core concept of biochemistry. So please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you once again.